Good morning, everybody. Hope you can all hear me. My name is Chris Davies from Model Office. Just a bit of background to us. We're a RegTech platform that enables firms to audit where they are against all rules and regulations in one place. And we also have Helen Clark, CEO of Mint Blue Consulting. And Helen is basically going to talk a little bit later about the SM&CR on project implementation. So today's webinar should last around about 40 to 45 minutes, and it is covering the crucial areas around just what the regime is, but also how to implement it. We've done a bit of work in the past in 2016 with the banks, and their biggest challenge in more ways than one wasn't just understanding the regime, but it was also how to implement the regime and maintain business as usual. So that's really what we're focused on today. This will be recorded, so get access to all the recordings of all our webinars that we do on our YouTube RegTech webinar channel, but we'll send this over to you once it's completed. And then you will basically be able to review it at your own leisure. And we will also be talking about a pack at the end that you can apply for and purchase through us, which is a full implementation pack, which covering everything we talked about today and also much more. Really, when we're talking about implementation, what we want to do is cover what we see as 7 crucial areas for your business. And any project planning needs to be done at a granular level across the team who are implementing it and across the business. So first and foremost, what we need to do really is understand the impact of this regime across the business. And in my view, in this industry, it's probably the biggest personal impactful regime that I've seen in those 27 years across the marketplace. It really affects individuals far more. It is a move away, as we'll see, from civil law to the FCA being the judge and jury, which is quite a scary environment to be in. The FCA have teeth, and it is enforceable. So we need to understand, all these key areas around the impact across the business, features across the business, who needs to be certified, the consequences of getting it wrong. We'll talk about. I've talked about business as usual and time management in getting it right. Looking at a root and branch review across all roles and responsibilities in the business. What the cultural processes are. The interesting thing around about the SM&CR is it really is about 2 key areas, which is the competency, the knowledge in your business to make sure that you can prove people with the right skills, with the right responsibilities and the right roles, and also conduct, which is about their behaviour and making sure inside and outside work as well that they are walking their talk. So that's important. And finally, but not least, is sustainability, making sure that this regime is bedded in to the culture within the business, because each year, every year, for example, you're going to have to certify the right staff, and you're going to have to ensure that you can prove that you've got your training and competency arranged in the right space as well. So from what we've seen in the marketplace and our experience in the implementation process of what success looks like from a project plan point of view, and also from a regulatory point of view, what they want to see, they're really looking for, ensuring that the senior people holding the senior management functions, the SMFs in your firm, know what they're responsible for. That's important, because this is all about accountability. It's a new accountability regime that the FCA are imposing, pretty much post the financial crisis of 2008-9. Then it's also ensuring, looking at the skills, the capabilities, the conduct of the right people, as I've mentioned, in the right place with the right roles and responsibilities. Ensuring that you've got the conduct rules which form the foundation for ongoing behaviour in the business. And that is that's by your training and competence procedures and program in your business, and making sure that that's in the right space. ensuring that you know that it is all about accountability, and it's all about effectively the FCA looking at what is the risk within your business to do harm, if you like, to the market in which you operate in. And again, the onus is on you to prove that you're not cause harm across consumer protection areas. So from that point of view, your accountability is somewhat higher, and the burden of proof is on you, not just the regulator, to prove that you're doing wrong, or you're in that zone of potentially harming the industry. Systems and controls are very important in this, and that blends into technology as well. But really, it's knowing that you've got the right governance procedure. The biggest problem that the FCA see, it certainly was reflected in their business plan that they produced earlier on this year in June, which is all about effectively ensuring that any failures around governance and cultural issues are protected within the business. And that's very hard to do because, as I'm sure you can imagine, culture is a very subjective issue. So you're going to have to really take a look at diagnostics across your business, that you know that you've got all this in place. And finally, as I've said, is the FCA will hold individuals to account, as we'll see. Now, the key area with this is that we see the SM&CR as pretty much the FCA's trump card. And what we're saying here is effectively is that they do have the teeth. This is all enforceable. Take action against firms that they are seeing aren't doing the right thing. It's a bit like, for example, in the papers recently, in Professional Advisor, I think it was, the FCA was saying that they're not afraid to close firms around the DB pension transfer issues they're seeing at the moment in the marketplace. It's the same thing with the SM&CR. They're really moving from being a watchdog to a guide dog to a guard dog mentality. Saw about 18 months ago the CEO of Barclays, he was fined £600,000 to try and silence a whistleblower, and that's just one example of what the FCA will do. So we've got to ensure that you've got the right systems controls around the business and the right foundations in and around the conduct and the competence areas, so that you are well prepared before December the 9th when this regime comes through. It's important to just have a recap and understand, what this regime is all about. It is a move from the approved persons regime to this new senior managers and certification regime. It's a mix of regimes. Effectively, you've got the senior managers at the top, which is all approved by the FCA. And then you've got the certified regime, which is the onus is on you, the firm, to ensure that, everybody each year and every year, the right people who are classified market risk takers, it can do detriment to the market, are all certified in the right way. And it's important that you know who those people are, as we'll talk about. And then underneath that, you've really got the conduct rules, which are enforceable. The conduct rules at the individual level pretty much reflect what's already there with the approved persons regime. But now what you've got is the senior management function conduct rules, which really the top three, as you'll see, talk about steps in case of breaches within the conduct rules, and that I would see as a real crucial part of this regime, which firms now need to ensure that they've got in place, because if you're found wanting in that area, that can undermine all the good work that you will hopefully be doing between now and 9th of December to get your firm in the right position. And then finally, but not least, this is really important, auxiliary staff. The FCA have been at pains who is not covered by this regime, which says to us, you know what, those who are covered are now under serious scrutiny, because it's basically saying that you need to know who's out and who's in, and you need to be very clear about that. And as we'll see in a minute, there's a few unintended consequences around this regime that we need to factor into that. As ever with compliance and regulation, it's not simple, it's not an exact science. There's many nuanced and sensitive, so we need to be very clear on any unintended consequences that can affect you as a business as part of this regime. It's important also to take a look at the categorization of the SM&CR and how the FCA are categorizing you. And as you'll see from these slides across them, what we've got is some, excuse me, some practical planning points that you can take away and apply to your business tomorrow. The FCA have an excellent tool on their website, which you can access, and it's a diagnostic tool. It's very simple, but you can plug in the information about your business and find out pretty much instantly what type of firm and how they're going to class you as a business. So you've got the limited scope firms, which is the majority of firms that they see in the marketplace. As you can see there's around about 50,000 firms that they need to pull underneath this regime. And really, it applies if you know, traditional one-man or woman band, sole trader, for example, then you will come under the limited scope categorization rules. Moving through to what we call the in-betweens, which is the core firms, which is pretty much the majority of firms that we're currently speaking to. They are not a sole trader. They're moving through. They've got more assets under management. They're a slightly bigger firm, and they're building and they're growing as a business. They've got more, in other words, because this is a people's-based regime. So, and then they're sandwiched between the final tier, which is the enhanced firms. As you can see, assets under management 50 billion or more, 30 million annual revenue, and so forth. So that's a lot of the banks, etc., who are in that environment there. But it's very important that you know what type of firm that you are categorized as, and also if that flips around as you build or business, will you fall back into a limited scope or will you fall into an enhanced firm, and so forth. So that's all important to map out within your project plan. And also, it's really important to understand how across those firm categorizations, how the different elements of the SM&CR map across. So you can see from this table here, there's a fair amount of elements. There's about 17 of them that you need to be aware of, many of which we'll go through in today's webinar. The most important thing here is that you really need to understand how they apply to your firm category. So you can see if you are an enhanced business, then you've got the whole lot to deal with. Core, you've pretty, and unlimited scope, you've pretty much got a lot of them to deal with. Limited scope less than the core. But the most important thing is, as part of your project planning procedure, you need to really map that across to your firm categorization to understand that they apply to you. And the practical planning point on this, which we keep emphasizing, as you'll see through this presentation, is that responsibility mapping is good practice. If you're a core firm or limited scope firm, or certainly a limited scope firm, prescribed responsibilities, we'll see, don't apply. But we still see responsibility mapping as important across. Doesn't matter if you're what type of category you are classed as, it's really important to do it, because it's really important to know who does what than ever before. The key components, again, just to re-emphasize what this is all about, the SMR is the pre-approval by the FCA. It's all about statements of responsibilities, duties of responsibility, and prescribed responsibilities, which we'll talk about. Fitness and propriety, criminal checks, and regulatory referencing. You need to go back 6 years now on the regulatory referencing area. So from that side of things, again, it's a far more granular and there's far more accountability involved. Certification regime, the onus is on the firm itself, but really this is all about, you know, assessing the fitness and propriety, and you having to jump through this hoop year in, year out to keep on certifying individuals, the right individuals within the business. And finally, but not least, the conduct rules. Again, is the two-tier process that we've got. The training and competence is the key to this, as we'll see in a minute, and the reasonable steps that you need to have in place if you're a senior manager. So let's regime when we talk about, you know, implementation, because as ever, if you're going to eat an elephant, not that I'd advise you to do it, you need to break it down into digestible chunks, so to speak. But the key area with this is because there are 3 different regimes, we would recommend you don't tackle the whole lot in one go. As you'll see from Helen's presentation, really what we're talking about is looking at each individual part of the regime, and then we can take a look at what parts to you as a firm, and then how to implement them on an ongoing basis and maintain business as usual. So let's start with the senior managers. As we've mentioned, it's the FCA have to approve them. You have to go through a process, as you'll see from Helen's presentation, about how that's done, fill in certain forms and so forth. Identifying who they are is probably the most important step, and therefore you need to know, who in your business will be a senior manager, management functions will apply, which prescribed responsibilities and statements of responsibilities and so forth. Now, the key area with this, which is interesting, we've seen a lot of firms who are starting to implement this, and what they're doing is they're writing a war and peace, if you like, around their senior managers' statements of responsibility. And that is, I'll be honest, a complete waste of time. What you need to be doing is being very, very focused on what these statements of responsibility the senior managers actually do. So in other words, it's not a job description. And we've seen too much of this go on in the marketplace, too much job descriptions written about a statement of responsibility. It's not what the FCA wants and need. What they need is a very, very focused, what we call ARCs, which is looking at what's actionable by the FCA, identifying clear accountability and responsibility within that particular role. Reflective basically looks at the role, the responsibility, and the work of the individual in relation to that firm. Clear, which is all about clearly describing the accountability and their responsibilities. And finally, succinct, which is all about only containing relevant information that these senior managers do in their job roles. So it's not a full-on job description. It's very much about their activities and their tasks, what they're responsible for, and also their delegation procedure and strategy, handover procedure and strategy, for example. You've then got to move through to the prescribed and other responsibilities. So I'll go through that in a little while for you, just so you can understand what those prescribed responsibilities are and how you can allocate them. There is the duty of responsibility for senior managers to take reasonable steps if there's a breach in the conduct rules. Again, we'll go through that when we talk about the conduct rules. Fit and proper assessment hasn't changed, really. That's still the same as the current regime. And then you've got the developed training and communication strategy. So again, from that perspective, the T&C, the training and competence strategy that you've got and the program that you've got in your business needs to be scrutinized further to make sure it covers everything that we need to cover, particularly under the conduct rules, and how that's communicated across all relevant parties. You've then got the onus on enhanced firms to map out responsibilities and establish procedures. Now, we would say, you know what, it's good practice if you're a core firm in particular to do that anyway. So that's kind of like something you might want to think about bringing in. And then what we've effectively looking at regarding the practical planning points for you, well, obviously mapping who is in the senior management team, who's in, who's out, looking at your statement responsibilities, the ARCs that I've talked about, the actionable, reflective, clear and succinct statements that you're going to put in the statements of responsibility. You need that as a standalone document because it will need to be reviewed by the FCA and it's submitted annually to the FCA. And obviously looking at the prescribed responsibilities, ideally one per role. I appreciate with some firms, because every firm's different, that might not be the case, but you need to make the case to the FCA of why it's being shared, if it's being shared, for example. And then you've got a 12-week rule, which is interesting. So if anybody leaves the role, for whatever, you need to ensure that you've got someone who can actually take those responsibilities within a 12-week time frame before you replace them or you bring that person in full time. So there's lots to think about regarding the senior managers regime, but as we'll go through this, you'll begin to understand how it's all interlinked and how, by mapping out roles, responsibilities and what goes with that, that will help you really understand how to ensure that you've got the right people in the right place here with the right roles, responsibilities. So when we talk about the SMF role overview, it's important to look at, what the FCA are interested in the sense of role types. So you've obviously got the executive, the C-suite at the top of the business, chief executive, chief financial officer, and so forth. Who's involved in oversight? Chairman, independent directors, could be non-exec directors, committee chairs, And then lines of defence and control, we call that, which is all the audit, the compliance, the chief risk officer, the old CF10 role, which will change to the SMF16 roles. So all that type of thing, you need to be really aware of what the FCA want in the sense of role types and what those roles are. And underneath this, all we've put down here is a simple chart there, a simple diagram, if you like, about the individual name, the job title, function, the prescribed responsibility, and board committee membership. That's how you can start to map out this within your business. The important thing, therefore, if you're a core firm, for example, these are the type of things that you might want to be thinking about. The governance functions, the chief exec will be an SFF1, the executive director, if you've got a non-exec on the board or non-execs on the board, we'll talk about non-execs in a little while. Then you've got SMF3 to allocate, you've got any partners in the business will come under that, and obviously whoever's a chair for the business. And then you've got the required functions with the compliance oversight and the money laundering reporting officer involved in the business. So the practical planning points on this is really, when you're implementing, is to understand that you can hold more than one senior management function, but each requires FCA authorization, and all senior management function roles are covered by regime. So effectively, anyone who's in an SMF will need to be certified. So there's definitely crossover between the three regimes that you need to be aware of too as you implement it. Now, this is a really important slide. They're all important, but this is really hyper important. So you need to map out, understand, and implement, these prescribed responsibilities. And of course, limited scope firms, sole traders, don't have to do this. Practice to look at it anyway and understand it, but you don't have to. But a core firm, you've got kind of 7 areas there, and enhanced 14. But the issue is that you just need to understand, what applies to you, who it applies to, and that they then understand how they're going to implement this within their role and job, role and statements of responsibility descriptions. So, probably in the majority, focus on the top 4 apply, certainly, and then with the bigger firms who, for example, hold client money, you've got number 5 in there, and so forth. So really, you need to get very granular on this and understand how each prescribed responsibility applies, who it applies to, and then that they effectively own it. Now, if you are looking at the planning points below, if you are sharing and dividing them, then you really need to put a good business case of why that's the case as a business, and make sure all this is about effectively is evidence-based practice, making sure that you've got all the data, all the evidence around why something's being shared, and also how many apply to your business and who it applies to. It's a really important slide. It's important to understand how you're going to map that out, and we'll talk about role mapping in a minute. So that will then showcase how we can do that. And there you go. It's the next slide. So on role mapping itself, this is kind of like crucial because even though if you're a core firm or a limited scope firm, you're not actually required to do this. We'd recommend that you do it because it's good practice. I would argue you are probably required to do it. You've got SIS 2.1, which is important to know in this area, because SIS 2.1 talks about the good old reasonable step the FCA want you to make around about, you need to be clear on who has the responsibilities in the business, and also be very clear on how your business affairs are monitored, how accurately they're monitored. So SIS 2 into this, and you can start to see how these rules and regulations overlap. And the other thing to mention as well is we recommend that you do this annually, even if you're a core firm, so that you're just role mapping. And we've got a system here that you can see where it maps out, an organogram, if you like, across all the people involved in your business. And then you've got the color-coded senior management function, prescribed responsibilities in the blue, and in the pink, you've got the overall responsibilities. So that gives you an idea of how you can start to map it over and who gets what within each of the functions as you build it as a business. And again, very important that you do this on an annual basis. Then we move through to outsourcing. Many firms that we see, the majority of firms that we see in the market, outsource. And if you're outsourcing to technology firms, if you're outsourcing to platforms, if you're outsourcing to DFMs or whatever for your business, you now need to be very clear of how this impacts the roles and responsibilities and the senior management functions within your business, because you need to ensure that you put the right due diligence, research and due diligence in place to ensure that there's clear and understandable accountability around who does what. Not fudge this at all, because if you do, then this will bite you when it comes down to looking at risk management around who's doing what within each roles. So we've broken this down into some key areas for you. So outsourcing governance really is all about being clear on ownership of the relationship. So define, who is the gatekeeper within your business, who owns that outsourced agreement, and that gatekeeper is fully accountable for that relationship. Look at the contract itself, that it's clearly setting out the services to be provided, including such items as exit terms, continuity terms, contingency arrangements, and so forth. Service level agreements, very important. Again, this might sound elementary for you, but we've done lots of research and lots of work and lots of consultancy with firms who have some of these in place, or even if they've got them in place, they're not granular enough. So service level agreements with any outsourced relationships are effectively looking at reporting, escalation if anything goes wrong, timeframes and so forth. Identifying key performance indicators and risk indicators, really looking at where things can go horribly wrong, and looking at the managed performance levels, the outsourced agreement. Service review meetings, very important to build into your board meetings or your committee meetings, investment committee, for example, if you're outsourcing to DFM, and so forth, to make sure that everything is watertight there. And then looking at how you're going to periodically review this with the individuals, and then how that is blended back into your governance arrangements around this full regime. So this is something a lot of firms miss within the SM&CR, so it's not hated really, but again, it's something that can bite you because a lot of firms do outsource, so that's important to factor in. Now, this is a busy slide, but I'll make no excuses for this, because apologies for this, because really, this is all parts and parcel about how to ensure that you've got the right processes in place, the right governance and controls and systems in place for the senior managers, moving through to recruitment, to onboarding, to commencement of the role. And again, Helen will talk a bit about this in a little bit more detail later. But this is all about effectively understanding that the CVs are accurate, they're up to date, and they're kept up to date. You're asking ideally each year, every year, for an up to date CV for the person within the business. So and that might sound nuts, but again, it's important that you've just got the very latest individuals who are in senior management functions. Roles, responsibilities recorded. Again, I've talked about it's not a job description, and also ensuring that you've got training records up to date. Now, I don't know how you do that individually. We've got, many firms do it, on an Excel spreadsheet, and that's fine. But there is technology out there that can help you with that type of thing. Not obviously Model Office, but other technologies. But again, depending on what systems you're using, we'd recommend that you revisit it to make sure that all those training records and the competency records are up to date. And then you've got the fitness and propriety assessment processes, moving through all the key areas across the disclosure and barring service checks, the fraud checks, the criminal checks, to make sure that there's no markers on the credit file. Again, that needs to be done right from the start, and the processes, and that needs to be evidenced all the way through. Qualifications and competencies assessed at the interview, moving through to, most importantly, when you're interviewing people. I always used to, when I was a wealth manager and interviewing for my team, it was all about, well, I never really knew if they're going to be good enough until they're out in the field. But I always had a hint around their personal characteristics, and that's the soft stuff. So rather than just look at this, bit like when you're with your clients and you're giving advice and guidance and planning advice, it's all about the importance of the soft skills as much as the hard facts. So same thing applies here, making sure that you've got all the soft stuff down around individuals' personal characteristics, what they're like in the job, what they're like outside work, is just as important, because that plays back to the competency and the conduct requirements of this regime. And then you've got to go back 6 years on the regulatory referencing from that side of things. Moving through to the onboard process, well, really, if you're onboarding new staff into the business, then it really is all about your induction programs, your learning and development plans, your training and competency areas, making sure all the statements of responsibility accurately reflects the aspects of affairs of the firm, and what these people do within their roles. For the forms that you need to sign up for, I'll leave for Helen, because she will talk about that a little bit later, and the new dates involved in all those forms. And also, really understanding that you've got all your ducks in order, so to speak, with the FCA before they actually commence their role. And once they're online, really it's looking at a holistic view, if you like. So what we want firms to do is move away from checklist tick box compliance into more of building a balanced scorecard of how people develop within your business, as you'll see in a minute. And we call that life cycling. So I'll touch on that through the process, which is basically through the certification regime. Before I do that, let's just take a look at NEDs. Some firms have non-exec directors on their board, and the key area with this is not all NEDs will require approval. So the best way to do this from a senior management function point of view is assess their influence on the business and map that out against the senior management functions. And if you do that, then you'll have a really good idea if they need to be go through the the process of approval and be certified or not. So again, having a NED on board is a good thing, and we certainly see it as great risk management strategy. But again, you need to be careful around this and understand how this works. And then certification regime, moving through to this second tier, if you like, of the regime. This is all about material risk takers, anyone with client asset oversight. Really, it's all about annual certification. And as you can see here, what we've laid out for you is look at the function, and then look at the approved person's equivalent, which will hopefully help you map it over to the new function, and then look at the description of how that applies. And again, you'll get copies of all this, and you'll get a recording of this. But this is important when you're looking at implementation, because you can start to map out how the functions apply, what you've already got in place, and then understand in a granular view what each function does, and how it applies to the individual. So the big ones obviously are client dealing, the old CF30 roles. You've also got areas around subject to qualifications. That's a various elements of the APA regime. But again, it's all about understanding who does what, do they apply or not. That's very important. So who's in, who's out from that perspective. With this, as we'll see a little later, is how this crosses over into other regimes like MiFID II. MiFID II has what are called information givers, and information givers is anybody who touches a client and is deemed of giving advice effectively to a client. And this can apply to firms who've got paraplanners. We've had many firms say, you know what, our paraplanners don't give advice to clients, but when we look deep down in what they're up to, they can be construed as giving advice to clients, and therefore they need to be certified, in our opinion. Again, it's down to you what you believe. You know your business better than anybody, but that's important to take a look at. Information givers is potentially an unintended consequence of this regime, so that's important for you to get it right in that role. If you are a AR, appointed representative firm, this doesn't apply. The whole thing So you can leave now, but no, I wouldn't suggest you do that, because at the end of the day, as you've probably seen, it's a highly enforceable regime. So even though you're not under the regime, your network or your, the entity that has all the DA responsibilities will be, and they will obviously ensure that you will have to be trained accordingly. So you do need to know about it. And again, this is an anomaly, and we see that the ARs will eventually come under this regime once the FCA realise that they've kind of got a blind spot there. So when we talk about life cycling, this is really important. What we want firms to do with compliance is move away from checklist tick box mentality. You've got to really look at things from a holistic point of view about how other regulations affect you, like a jigsaw, and build a balanced scorecard across, in this particular case, in certification, what the actual issues are, from identifying the role, initial assessment, annual certification, conduct, concerns, training, competency, breach reporting, and leaving the role. But the key area with it all out, how it maps across your existing culture and your existing systems, and what needs to change. And again, Helen will talk about this a little later. And we've mentioned the practical planning points there is watch out for information givers and identify those who can cause significant harm, and redesigning your T&C plan. So let's take a look at the conduct rules itself. The conduct rules replace the APA principles and guidelines, and they are really a very high level approach. There's two tiers to it. This tier itself, in the first tier, will give you an understanding of how this works. From the APA point of view, there's not much changed at all. But when we talk about the second part of the regime, this is really important to factor in, because this is all about the senior management conduct rules. And the top three are all about reasonable steps, taking reasonable steps in case there's a breach. So you really need to understand, if you're a senior manager, how this applies to your business and what you're going to do as a breach within the conduct rules. And again, what we're looking at really is recycling all this around. What are the key issues? Mapping it out, putting across onto your existing governance, your existing systems and controls, looking at any blind spots and look at any gaps, and making sure that they're all completed and filled. And as we talked about earlier on, conduct rules are a foundation for behaviour, ensuring those reasonable steps are understood, getting together a breach is important, and we have a breach log in our implementation pack, as we'll talk about at the end, that you can just use within your business. And then follow-up actions and management information reviews are very important. Finalising for you from my part, what we've got here is auxiliary staff. This is effectively, who isn't covered by the regime. You need to know this, very important. So it then tell you who's in from that side of things. But as I say, the FCA have gone to pains in looking at who is in and who's out. Most important slide, I think, is looking at reasonable steps and the actions the FCA will take across the regime, really. So from that side, what we're looking at effectively is understanding, if there is a breach, which SMF was responsible, and if they took reasonable steps or not, reasonable step considerations, clarity of roles, responsibilities, nature and complexity of business, looking at, you've got the evidence-based practice in place, oversight arrangements. And the FCA really will consider the statements of responsibility, which we've talked about, your responsibility map, which is why it's good to have it, even if you're not actually explicitly told to do it, operations and how responsibilities were allocated, SMF roles, responsibilities, reference records, and relationship between the SMS and those of other SMS, how everybody interrelates within the business. So, two case studies here, and I won't go through them now because the case studies form part of the pack. So if you want the pack, and we'll talk about it at the end, these case studies just give you an idea from a limited scope, from a core firm and an enhanced firm, about what the key areas you need to be looking out for by the definition of the firm itself. So this will just give you an idea of how you can start to map it out across your business. And then we've also got some questions for you to action, look at of benchmarking, or where you currently are, what are the key issues. And this was really taken from the bank's issues that they had from implementing the SM&CR in 2016. So now what I'm going to do is hand over to Helen, if I can find her on the system. And Helen will just give you an idea of how she's mapping across the project plan and how between now and December the 9th. Over to you, Helen.
Thanks, Chris. Good morning, everyone. My name's Helen Clark. I own Mint Blue Consulting. We offer tailored project management, consultancy and training primarily for companies in the financial services area. So Chris has kindly covered off the high level of what for the regime. So this next part of the webinar will take you through a project approach to help you structure what needs to be done in preparation for the December deadline. So just before we get into that, we'll have a brief look as to why you need to have a project. Move on to the next slide. Thank you. So why do you need a project? It's a very good question. I've spoken to a number of people in the industry, some of who have been through the process already and some who are just starting to think about it. So one person I know is now a chief actuary at a leading insurance company, and he's already been through the process. He's mentioned that his responsibilities have increased significantly with the changes. He's got an extended team who are very much looking at how the future looks in actuarial terms. And he's also very aware he's now potentially personally liable in the event of a breach. So obviously they've had quite a big project on that side for his company already. Likewise, an ex-colleague of mine, Mark, he's high profile in the industry. And he mentioned when I last saw him, he's now become a NED for several companies and he's about to become the exec director of another. So again, when we were discussing the new regime, he realised that no one's actually discussed his NED roles with him and the new levels of responsibility that might be required. So he's gone away to investigate further. On the other side of the discussion, I had a really interesting conversation back in February with a compliance person who challenged the need for a project. As far as he was concerned, it was a straight mapping exercise and they were halfway through. The reality is that every firm is different, they're all different sizes, different requirements. Also, the liability has changed and is demonstrated by the Barclays CEO, and that's just part of the fine he ended up with, $321,000. It just shows how far the legislation can go. So the FCA documents talk a lot about this being a mapping exercise, but it's making sure that actually you understand what's coming into force and people changes within your organisation. For example, existing staff might not want to take on the additional responsibilities, especially if they're thinking about retiring, but other people will see this as an opportunity to take on new positions. So whatever the size of the firm, the answer is yes, a project is required, even if it's just treated as a checklist for your firm. So let's have a look to see who's likely to be needed to be involved in this project from a resource point of view. So as you can see, there are a number of different areas of the business that need to be involved. There is a tendency to think of this as just as a compliance project, and it is. It's FCA legislation. They very much do need to be involved in this. But if you have a project of this nature, it's about making sure the key people are involved. So HR, they will be key because they need to look at people who are likely to be changing their roles and also assisting with the statements of responsibility. Training is also another key requirement. That could be undertaken by compliance. It might fall under T&C. So that might be a combined role. Obviously, the senior managers need to be involved. They're going to be probably the key decision makers, and they're going to have the bulk of the responsibility. So you're really looking at a minimum of about 3 people in the team. Meeting weekly, either face-to-face or by conference phone, even if it's just for half an hour, will keep any project on track. As I always say, the devil is in the detail. I've just been running through this slide with a large financial services firm, and it's interesting to see how far they've taken it. They've got all these people involved and they've got key stakeholders from around the company, so all the teams in the firm can be involved in the process going through. So having looked at the project team, let's have a look at the structure of the project very briefly. So it's all about making sure that everything happens in a logical order. Starting at the top, you need to understand what your firm type looks like. We'll have a brief look at some of these areas in a little bit more detail over the next couple of minutes. Then it's all about mapping between the regimes, and we have a spreadsheet within the pack that actually helps with this. It's then checking and allocating those responsibilities. Again, we have a pack, part of the pack allows that to be mapped through. Then it's looking at the fit and propriety checks, making sure they're all in line, and then it's making sure the training's happened, which could be in parallel to the checks. It's making sure that that's a separate work stream. So they're all the key areas you need to have a look at. Just very briefly, we'll whiz through some of the other slides just to give you a little bit more context around that, starting with the firm type. So, as Chris said, there are 3 firm types: limited, core and enhanced. So it's about checking your classification, making sure your firm hasn't changed in the last 12 months. And it's also making sure that the FCA actually agrees with what you think your classification actually is. We have a look at the mapping of the regimes. So this is making sure you actually map. Hopefully, this is a straight mapping exercise between the current regime and the new regime. But as you can see, I've got a couple of examples on the slide from the mapping spreadsheet to put together. You've got a number of options that might map to the new regime. So all the areas in italics down the bottom, they're all the different options that could be mapping, for instance, to the Chief Financial Officer. At the same time, you'll have some that are just a direct map. So the CF1 director will map through to the CFF3 exec director. Just making sure for enhanced firms on that side that it's very clear. On the core firms, there's less options, but it's still making sure that that mapping is actually happening, because not everybody will necessarily map across automatically. We move on to the next slide. Just have a quick look at that. So once you have your senior managers in place, it's about allocating the prescribed responsibilities and then the significant management certification function if your firm is large enough. So core firms just have the 5 PRs, enhanced firms will have the 12 PRs. Ideally, PR should be wholly owned by one person. If they're not, and there's 2 people looking at that job, that is acceptable as long as you can justify what's actually happening. So if we then have a quick look at the fit and propriety check. On top of the current assessments that you're undertaking, there are some criminal record checks, which are enhanced checks required from the 9th of December. So it's about having your DBS set up in preparation. And also, as Chris has already mentioned, about the regulatory references from the 9th of December and making sure that you've actually got the new processes in place as part of the work stream under the fit and propriety check. And part of the pack that we've got also includes a project template, which you can amend in Excel to fit in with what you need to be doing. We just have a quick look at the enhanced firms for any firms that are on the phone at the moment. So Form K, and I've got a little bit more about forms on the next couple of slides coming through. Form K will need to be submitted, and you need to look at what's involved with that. Obviously, it involves a responsibility map, which you can find through the FCA regulations, and statements of responsibility for each senior manager. And as Chris said, they need to be self-contained. They don't need to be over-engineered. You can have multiple SMFs under one statement of responsibility, but it's important to remember that the FCA can request them at any time. Although you have to submit them for the enhanced firms, you still need them in place. It's about making sure that you've got all your key areas and activities and management functions set up and covered. And it's also you've got handover processes. So any senior manager joining the firm is really clear about what they're going to be doing, and they've got all the required information and materials to actually do the job. Let's have a quick look at the forms. There are loads of forms, and every scenario for a firm is different. You need to think and look at forms if you're looking to change any of your approved individuals. It will be worth having a look at this area full stop. There are some key dates. So from the 9th of September, there's going to be a new Form A for anybody taking up roles, senior management roles, after the commencement date. If they're taking up the role before the commencement date, that's going to be the previous form. From the 9th of December or before then, that's the advised deadline to submit all your forms to the FCA. And the 2nd of December is the cut-off date for Form K conversion notifications. So although the regime doesn't kick in until the 9th of December, there's some pre-dates that need to be taken into consideration. So we're worth having a look at the guide that the FCA have put together and have a look at the most common scenarios plus all the other forms that are actually going to be available for you. Then coming on to training, which was the last work stream we had a look at. So obviously training's ongoing all the time. People are going through learning and developing their skills. But it's making sure that you make sure the right people are being trained. You've got your ancillary staff listed who don't need to be training, so people like cleaners. Paraplanners are falling into maybe, maybe not, so you need to consider whether they're having contact with clients. A lot of companies are doing a belt and braces approach on this one. And it's making sure there is a senior manager allocated to ensure that the training has been undertaken. It's important to remember that the training is going to be carrying on beyond the end of this year, because some of your members of staff won't need to be trained until December 2020. So that work stream is going to run for the next 18 months. If we move on to the next slide. So that's just very briefly about me. We'll move on quickly again. So, as I mentioned, we've got a project plan and guide and mapping spreadsheets and templates as part of the pack, plus all the documents that Chris and his team have put together, which gives you a lot around the what. There's an email address at the bottom there, info@modeloffice.co.uk with a hyphen in between. So if you are interested and would like more information, please do email that address, and that will give you all the slides in more detail of what we've been covering today. I don't know, Chris, if we've got time to just have a quick look, a snapshot of what the project template and the mapping spreadsheet before everybody finishes on the call. I appreciate I'm keeping an eye on the time as well. So just a very brief snapshot. As you can see, this shows the firm type, the mapping, allocation of responsibility. So all the headlines are put together. It then breaks it down further into the next level. It's all been designed in Excel, so you can actually put in what you would like in terms of your project plan. And then broken down the mapping areas into the 3 types of core firms, core, limited and enhanced. So this is just an example very quickly of the core firm. It shows all the mapping at the top, as I said, the direct maps and where there's possible maps. It also works down to the prescribed responsibilities and the certification function mapping as well. So you've actually got an audit and a trail as to what you've actually done within your firm. Thank you, Chris.
Okay, thanks, Helen. Well, look, I think we're very much there. We've run slightly over time. I really appreciate all of you hanging on. So obviously, this is of interest to you. As I mentioned again, as Helen mentioned, that address at the bottom. If you've got any questions, any queries, you want more information about this pack, there's actually more to this pack there. We've also got a full comprehensive report for you, which we can send over to you as well, and webinars. Not just this webinar, but we've got a further 4 webinars that we've recorded throughout the year, which we will give you access to as well. Important to also mention what we're doing going further on. Another 3 of these webinars going into Q3, Q4 this year, and we're also looking to run at least another 4 workshops. We've already run workshops in London and up north, which have all been very well attended. We also make them CPD-able as well, so you'll get CPD. They run for about 3 hours, and we pretty much talk about exactly what we talked about today, but the emphasis now is more on the how, not just the what of how going forward. So look, have a great week. You'll get an email very shortly from us with a copy to this particular webinar and also more details on the pack itself. And thanks so much for taking the time this morning to learn more about the SM&CR.
Thank you, everyone.